Good afternoon, everyone. Country Flyboy here, and today, instrument approach charts. I'm sure this is one everybody wanted to see. Okay, so we're going to talk today how to read instrument approach charts. Note, we will not be talking about how to fly the instrument approach. There's more to flying the instrument approach than just being able to read the chart. You also got to be able to translate this information into your aircraft, which is different depending on which aircraft you're flying and its avionics setup, yada yada yada. So we won't be talking about flying it. We won't be talking about the chart references or anything like that. That all goes back into flying the approach. We're going to be talking simply about reading an instrument approach chart. Unfortunately, the only way to really talk about an instrument approach chart is if we first know what exactly is an instrument approach. And this is an instrument approach. An instrument approach, forgive the green squiggly line, is nothing more than a way to take the aircraft from the en route environment and down to a position where a normal landing can be made. Note, that does not mean that the instrument approach will take you down to the runway. In some approaches, including one we're going to look at today, it may take you here. It might drop you off next to the airport at 1,000 feet. I've seen some that do that. So they don't take you down to a runway, not all the time, although most of the time they do. Some take you down to the runway, some drop you off just short of the runway, others will just take you over to the airport at 1,000 feet and you're on your own from there. So let's break down an approach and simplify it a bit. An approach is really nothing more than straight lines flown between waypoints, and there's an asterisk there. That asterisk means that sometimes special maneuvers may have to be made. The only time a special maneuver is really needed is on the initial approach segment and the missed approach segment. Descents to predetermined altitudes at predetermined spots, and you're guaranteed to not wreck the airplane as long as you're following the published approach. So this is your basic instrument approach setup here. We're on the en route environment. We get to an en route fix. We take a transition to the initial approach fix, fly the initial leg where we have to do the special maneuver of a course reversal, then the intermediate leg if there is one. There isn't always. And then the final approach leg, which takes us hopefully down to the runway. Again, it may not. And then if required, the missed approach where special maneuvers may also be made there. The initial, with the exception of the reversal, the initial, the intermediate, and the final usually are just straight lines between waypoints. The initial can be different because it often has the course reversal or a DME arc or whatever. But regardless, the approach is the same. It's just straight lines flown between waypoints with the asterisk needed in certain places. So here is a view of an instrument approach chart. And it shows the chart divided into certain sections. So real quick, let's look at the en route environment, and here's our flight plan. We took off from Tallahassee, vectored to the Greenville VOR along Victor 198 to Taylor, where we took Tango 204 to Brunswick. If we weren't RNAV equipped, we would have took Victor 198 to Mana, then Victor 441 to Brunswick. But we're RNAV equipped, so we're taking Tango 204. I stopped the flight plan at Brunswick because we're going to be looking at these two airports, Brunswick Golden Isles and Brunswick McKinnon, both of which have instrument approaches. So those are the two airports we're going to be looking at. I got their charts pulled up. So at this point when we're flying along this, we need to know how are we going to get from Brunswick to the airport of our choice. You might be thinking, radar vectors, they'll vector you, and they most likely will. But what if the radar's down? What if a storm knocks out the radar? That's when the full procedure approaches come into play. Or what if a center is busy and they can't take time to vector you, they got to focus on something else, then they might clear you for the full procedure approach. So we need to know how to read the chart. So real quick, let's just talk vectors. Radar vectors will take you to the final approach fix. That's the goal. ATC will vector you to bring you on the final approach course somewhere between the final approach fix and 5 miles prior to the final approach fix. So if you can look at this chart here, if we're getting vectored to final on this approach, which is the RNAV runway 7 into Brunswick Golden Isles, ATC is going to give us radar vectors to bring us on to the 069 course between Dompe and Yoko. That's it. Alright, so let's look at the different sections of the approach chart. We have the margins, the briefing section, highlighted in blue. Margins are in green, briefing's in blue. Plan view is in purple here. Profile view is in orange. Minimum section is in red. And the airport sketch I've put here in a dark gray, kind of blackish color. Now, it's important to note that sometimes people like to mix and match the profile view and the minimums. I like to stress that these are two different sections because they show different things. And I also don't want you to get confused. Some people call this the airport sketch, or I call it the airport sketch, and this is the term used by the FAR AIM. Some people refer to this as the airport diagram. I prefer airport sketch so as you don't get confused with the actual airport diagram that we talked about in the first video of this series. Alright, so each section contains different information. All of it is important to us. So let's break down each section first. The first section, the green one here, is the margins. What does the margins contain? And why would we care? Well, it contains the instrument approach title. See here, RNAV GPS runway 7. So we know this is an RNAV approach to a runway 7. It contains the city, state, and airport name the approach serves. Brunswick, Golden Isles, BQK, and Brunswick, Georgia. Contains the straight-in runway and the approach type. Runway 7, meaning the straight-in runway for this approach is 7, and the approach type is an RNAV or GPS, depending on which one you want to fly. A note here, if no straight-in runway for the approach, a letter is used, and we got one of those pulled up here as soon as I find it. There's no straight-in runway for this approach, and you can see they affix it with a letter. This is the VOR DME B approach into Brunswick Golden Isles. So if we were flying this approach, we start at Brunswick, we fly the radial 359 outbound until we're 12.3 DME, and that's the missed approach point. At some point before 12.3, we would hopefully see the airport and make a circle to land on the runway. They contain the effective dates on both sides of the margin. So this chart was effective 5th of March 2015 to the 2nd of April 2015. It just went out of date. Can't use it. We'll use it for examples, but we can't use it to fly. It also contains the publication book. So approach procedures are public knowledge, and they're published in U.S. terminal procedure publications, of which there are a lot. There's a lot. They divide the U.S. into certain sections: northwest, southwest, north central, south central, northeast, southeast, yada yada yada, and each one has a number. This particular approach is in the Southeast 4 book, so you can look in the Southeast 4 book if you want to. Does that really apply in most modern cases? No, because we're using electronic charts, but they still make these books published. I got an old one right here. The books contain a lot of information. They're very useful too. So that's the margins. Next one we have is the briefing section, highlighted here in blue. What's the briefing section contain? It contains nav-aid frequencies and final approach course, right here. No nav-aid frequencies for this approach because it's an RNAV, but if we look back to that VORB, we can see it does contain a nav-aid frequency. The SSI VOR-TAC is on 109.8, channel 35. Final approach course is 359. It contains landing information such as the touchdown zone elevation, runway length, and approach lights. If you look, let's see, runway length 8,001 feet, touchdown zone elevation 26, airport elevation 26. And down here between the notes and the missed approach, it contains the approach lights. Me personally, I wish that was over here. I consider that more part of the landing information, but they put it there. It has notes for equipment outages. This big block here that nobody in Flight Sim ever reads is, this contains your notes for equipment outages. So when something's broken you would go here. For instance, it says for, and I need to zoom in a bit because I can't really read that. For uncompensated bar and VNAV systems, LNAV, VNAV not available below 15 degrees Celsius, 5 degrees Fahrenheit, or sorry, negative 15 Celsius, or above 48 Celsius, 118 Fahrenheit. So if the temperature is extremely low or extremely high, and then you can't use the LNAV, VNAV minimums, is basically what that is saying, unless you have an uncompensated Barra VNAV system. So yeah, when certain conditions apply or when certain things are out of service, this tells you what to do. It's usually an increase minimums or use a different altimeter setting. Text version of the missed approach is also contained in the briefing section right here. It's a full briefing of the missed approach in text form. Climb to 3000, direct Wargo via the 016 track to Bourne and hold. And it contains COM radio frequencies in the order you need them. So as we're approaching this airport for landing, we would first need AWOS on 124.175. We'll be getting approach information from Jacksonville Center, 126.75. Note that frequency. It may be different in flight sim or even in real life, but if at any point during this approach they switch you over to 126.75, that should ring a bell, seeing that you're about to get cleared for the approach, because this is the last controller you're going to be talking to prior to switching to the airport's tower or the CTAF frequency in this case. Then it has the clearance delivery frequency for some reason. That's usually at the end. I don't even know why they put that on the chart, but it's there. They usually put it last, but in this case they have it first for some reason. And clearance delivery at this airport is an RCO anyway, so I don't even know why that's there. Unicom or CTAF. Real quick, I want to mention there is a difference between Unicom and CTAF, even though they often share a frequency. They don't always share a frequency, but they usually do. Unicom is for talking to people on the ground at the airport, like an FBO or a terminal or something, at the uncontrolled airports. So even at controlled airports would have Unicom frequencies, and that's how you would talk to an FBO. As you were taxiing in, you'd say, hey, Shelt Air, are y'all open tonight? Or do y'all have this? Where are y'all at? I don't know where y'all are at on the airport, yada, yada, yada. It's also useful for getting field advisories if you're coming in VFR. CTAF is the advisory frequency, and I know a lot of flight simulators like to refer to CTAF as a Unicom. There is a difference between the two. Alright, so that's the briefing section. Plan view is next, and it's pretty obvious what it is. Plan view is just a top-down view of the ground track of the approach. It shows the nearby obstacles or terrain and approved transitions. It'll have your minimum safe altitude and limitation notes. So if we look, this is the ground track of our approach. Note back to the Sid Star videos. The bold line is the approach itself. The thinner lines are the transitions. And they would have an altitude if they are flyable. If you see a thin line with a course but no altitude or distance information associated with it, that's not a flyable track. That's just for navigation purposes. So here we see the bold line extends from Equo and Grizzly to Dompey, then goes to Yoko, then the runway. The transitions are Brunswick. Well, first of all, the transitions is Equo, Grizzly, Brunswick, Starry, and Bourne. A transition can start, it'd be the first waypoint on the bold line, or it could be the first waypoint on a thin line, either or. And we see the minimum safe altitude over here, as well as limitation notes and obstacles close to the airport. I think they show the obstacles that are anywhere near the approach corridor, which is the section of, I think it's like a 1 mile extension either side of the approach center line is the approach corridor. And as long as you're in the approach corridor, you're not going to hit anything. That does get narrower the lower you go, though. It starts with like 1 mile, but on final it could be as low as half a mile. Alright, so we have nearby obstacles and procedure limitations, like if right here, procedure not available for arrivals at Starry on the Victor 1 northeast bound. So if we go back to the en route chart, and let's see if we're going Victor 1 and we're northeast bound to Starry, we cannot fly this approach into Brunswick Golden Isles. If we are southeast bound on Victor 1 to Starry, then we can, so we could actually get cleared for the full procedure approach. If we're flying Victor 1 southeast bound, they could say Cessna 13312, cleared for the RNAV runway 7 approach in the Brunswick Golden Isles via the Starry transition. So we would go to Starry, then fly the approach. But if we're northeast bound on Victor 1, we can't go to Starry, then fly the approach. We'd have to use some other transition, most likely the Brunswick transition. So that's the plan view. The profile view, again, obvious what it is. The profile view is a cross-section of the approach showing your crossing altitudes. It's also the initial, intermediate, step down, and final approach segment altitude information, and it's the only place where you can find initial approach altitude information. Sometimes they might have intermediate, step down, and final approach mixed in with the plan view, but a lot of times you're better off getting it on the profile view because it can be confusing to find it on the plan view. It also has your distances between waypoints. Again, plan view will have that as well, but you can back it up with the profile view. It has a missed approach slideshow, as I like to call it. So if we look back, we see up in the top right corner here, the missed approach slideshow, quote unquote, which is basically just a picture version of the first part, usually, or the entire missed approach procedure. So ignoring this up here, in fact, if I cover it up, draw a box over it so I can't see it, I can see the missed approach is climb straight to 3,000, go to Wargo, then track 016 to Bourne. Just from reading that, not even having to look at the plan view. And if I look back at the text version, climb 3,000, direct Wargo, via track 016 to Bourne and hold. So yeah, this is basically a slideshow telling you the first part usually or sometimes the entire missed approach procedure. Useful when you are on the final approach segment and you're making your last chart references, because pretty much all of the last chart references are made on the profile view. Next, it shows missed approach slideshow, descent angle and threshold crossing height. Let me correct that. Descent angle and threshold crossing height. Right here, we see the GS 3 degrees. It means the glide slope is 3 degrees on this approach. That's also our descent angle. Sometimes it may have it as the descent angle. It will not be on this approach. This one. And you know if it's a descent angle or glide slope, because if you look here, it has a descent angle. It says 3.04 degrees, and then it has a little half a triangle there. Versus on our example chart here, it has 3.0 degrees, prefixed by GS, which means that's the glide slope descent angle versus the descent angle here. That is the angle you're going to be flying on your descent on final approach. It also has the threshold crossing height right below it, which is 58, which if you fly the published descent angle all the way down from the final approach fix, see the runway prior to minimums, cross minimums where it says to cross it, and when you get over the runway threshold, maintaining that descent angle, you will be at 58 feet above the runway. That's basically what threshold crossing height means. This is how high above the threshold you're going to be when you cross it. Is there anything else in the profile view? Visual descent point, if applicable. So you see this little V here? We're right here where it says an asterisk 1.3 nautical miles to runway 7, and then it's got a straight line. There's a V right above the bold line. That is the visual descent point. The visual descent point serves two purposes. One, the purpose is it says it may typically when you pass the final approach fix, you would descend as quickly as practical down to the minimums and fly straight and level at the minimums until at the missed approach point or until you see the runway. However, the presence of a visual descent point means that for some reason it is unsafe to go down to minimums prior to the visual descent point. So you may want to descend to a couple hundred feet above the minimums, then when you hit the visual descent point, go down to minimums. And I'm looking on the thing here. I'm guessing the reason they have it on this approach is because of that obstacle there, at 234 feet obstacle. If you pass Yoko and then descend down to, let's say, the LPV minimums of 226 feet, which is 200 feet above the ground, you're going to be lower than that obstacle there, that 234-foot tower or whatever it is. And if you're off course, you could hit it. So that's why they're saying don't descend down to minimums prior to the VDP. You still need to descend, though, which is depicted here. But you wouldn't want to go down to minimums. Say about 200 feet above minimums. You don't want to go lower than that until the visual descent point. The visual descent point also serves another purpose, and you can actually calculate the visual descent point yourself if it's not charted. Here it's charted where it says 1.3 nautical miles to runway 7. But if it's not charted, you can actually calculate this, and let me see if I remember how to do it. Bring up the calculator. I believe it is the threshold crossing height? No, it's the height above threshold at missed approach point, which on this approach is 200 feet for this category, LPV DA. So 200 divided by the descent angle minus the decimal. So the descent angle here is 3 degrees, so 300. Our visual descent point is 0.6 miles from the runway. That's our calculated one. It's charted here. When it's not charted, you kind of need to use the other reason for the visual descent point, which is the earliest or the latest point in which a normal descent to landing can be made. So if you're at minimums and you're holding at minimums, it's useful to know when's the latest point that if you can't see the runway, you're going to have to make some extreme descending to make it when you do see it. So if we cross Yoko and descend down to minimums here, in fact, let's bring up a different chart, just not to confuse people. So here, no visual descent point is depicted. So final approach fix is Yatgi here. So we cross Yatgi at 1600, then we descend down to, let's say, 420, which is 404 feet above the runway. So let's real quick recalculate. 404 feet above the runway divided by 304, which is the descent angle minus the decimal. Our visual descent point is 1.3 miles from the runway. So when we're 1.3 miles from the runway, that's our visual descent point. And what that means is from minimums at the visual descent point, if we see the runway, then we can continue this 304 degree descent angle and make the runway. After the visual descent point, then we're going to need an increasingly steep descent angle to make the runway if we see the runway later. So basically what this is telling you is if you haven't seen the runway by the time you hit the visual descent point, the odds of you having to fly the missed approach are increasing because you're getting close to the runway and you should be able to see it by now. That's the second reason for a visual descent point. That's only for if you calculate the visual descent point ourselves. And again, to calculate the visual descent point, you take the threshold, or not, you take the height above threshold, this number right here, 404. So real quick, we're going to show the minimum section off. This first number, 420-1, is the barometric minimum descent altitude for this approach. So 420 MSL is the lowest we can go on this approach without seeing the runway. That -1 is the visibility requirement in miles. We need to have at least 1 mile visibility to fly this approach. This next number here in smaller font is 404. This is the minimums above the ground. So when we're at 420 feet MSL, we're going to be 404 feet above the runway threshold. Basically is what that means. So when we calculate our VDP, we need the height above threshold, 404, which is the height above threshold at minimums. So 404, and we divide that with the descent angle, just drop the decimal. So our descent angle in this approach is 3.04. We drop the decimal, that's 304 divided by 304. That gives us 1.3.28999, whatever. We just care about the first two. Don't bother trying to round this up. Just use the first two. It's close enough for government work. 1.3. 1.3 DME, or not DME, nautical miles from the threshold is the visual descent point. And if you kind of look at it, you can see that this is kind of showing you that right there. That looks like it's about 1.3, because we could fit probably an additional 3 of these little straight lines here in between Yagi and runway 4. So that's the profile view. And we've touched on the minimums. Let's go ahead and read what the minimum section is. Minimum, it shows your minimum descent altitude and decision height in both barometric and radio, i.e. MSL, AGL. Note on the radio or AGL, that's actually the height above threshold, not the height above the terrain. So you could be only 300 feet above the terrain here, but you're still 400 feet above the threshold. All right. It shows the minimums for different final approach and landing types. So going back to, let's say, this one. We have the straight-in ILS, runway 7, straight-in localizer, runway 7, or the circling minimums. That's different approach and landing types. So straight-in ILS is if we're flying this approach and we're going to land straight into runway 7, and the ILS, localizer, and glide slope are both functional. If the glide slope's not functional or we're not using it, we're flying the localizer approach. 400 feet is our minimums. If we're not landing runway 7, we're going to go to another runway, but we're flying this approach, then circling minimums are used. So the minimums are 504. 540, sorry. So yeah, shows the minimums for different final approach and landing types, and also different aircraft categories. Real quick, I want to talk approach categories. First of all, what is an approach category? Well, it's similar to the climb thing that we talked about in SIDS, in that your climb gradient, or descent gradient in the case of an approach, is a constant, but the faster you go, the higher your climb or descent rate needs to be in order to maintain the same climb gradient. So that's where the approach categories come from. They need you to maintain a specific climb or descent gradient, or descent angle, in this case, 3.0 degrees. But the faster you go, the higher your descent rate's going to have to be to maintain that descent gradient. So they've broken up the minimums into different categories. Faster you are, the higher the minimums are, because you need more time to react. So there are several categories. There's Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and Echo. Now, you can almost forget about Echo. You're almost never going to see it. So let's go through them. Now, what decides your category? Your aircraft will have a specific category. You can figure this out either from its VREF speed at maximum landing weight. So if you're an airliner, a jet, take the maximum landing weight. What is the VREF speed for maximum landing rate? Okay. If you don't know the max landing rate VREF, or if there isn't one, you would use 1.3 times VSO, which is stall speed dirty. So when you dirty up the plane, gear out, flaps out, what speed does it stall at? You can only be in one category, and you can only use higher cats, but not lower. For example, if you were operating at a speed, if you're normally in Cat B, but for some reason you have to operate in a speed that puts you in Cat C, then you use Cat C minimums. You can only use higher categories, not lower ones. So if you're normally Cat C, but something's happened and you can operate in Cat B, you can't use Cat B minimums. You still have to use Cat C. Now, how do we know which cat we are in? We figure out our speed, and then which one is it? So if our speed is 90 knots or less, we're Cat A. That's your single engine props and some twins. If it's 91 to 120 knots, you're Cat B. That's twin engine props and some turboprops. If you are C, if you're 121 knots to 140 knots, you're Cat C, which is some airliners, mostly the light jets like the Learjets, the Honda jets, and the Citations and whatnot. Cat D is 141 to 165 knots. This is where most airliners and some military aircraft will be. And Cat E is 166 knots or more. You will very rarely ever see Cat E printed on most charts. In fact, the only time if you see Cat E printed on a chart that you're flying, it should get your attention, because that could mean there are military aircraft flying this approach, which could mean it might be designed for high speed. Really, you're ever only going to see Cat E on the military charts, like this one here, the high TAC in Zulu, runway 18 left in the Moody Air Force Base. As you can see, it doesn't show Cats A and B because they don't care about them. They only care about Cats C, D, and E. So this is a military chart. Versus here, no civilian aircraft is going to be operating in Cat E, so only A, B, C, and D are shown. Alright? Okay, so quick reiteration. You're only in one. Your speed decides your Cat. It's either your VREF speed or your 1.3 VSO speed. You can only be in one, and you can only use higher categories. You're either A, B, C, D, or E. And that is, A is 90 or less, B is 91 to 120, C 121 to 140, D 141 to 165, and E 166 or more. So that is your approach categories. And the last bit we have is the airport sketch. The airport sketch, and I'm bold this and underline it, not to be confused with airport diagram. And here's why you shouldn't confuse it with airport diagram, and why I prefer the term airport sketch, not diagram, is a low detailed layout of the airport and its runways. So look here. Do you see any kind of detail? I mean, this doesn't show us where buildings are. It doesn't list taxiways or anything like that. It just shows us a general layout of the airport, runway, taxiway, and ramp. We have no idea what each taxiway is, where the terminal is, where the FBO is, where the Gulfstream hangar is, any of that. This just shows us the general layout of the airport. That's why you shouldn't confuse it with the airport diagram. Now, it also contains some other useful information, notably the runway lighting information. So we got approach lights up here, but runway lights are listed down here. In this case, it's in the bottom left corner of the airport sketch. Runway end identifier lights for runway 25, so the threshold of 25 is going to have 2 flashing strobes next to them. And high intensity runway lights for runway 725. That means runway 725 will have high intensity lights for us to make use of. It shows obstacle position and height, and that's only obstacles in the general vicinity of the airport. So say 1 mile around the airport is the obstacles they're going to show here. And we can see there are 2 of them. There's a 92-foot obstacle just off to the side of runway 7, and another one over here near the ramp, a 107-foot obstacle. Can't really see it unless I zoom in, but if you note this 92 with a plus or minus symbol next to it, that, again, just like on en route and SIDS and STARS, that means the measured height of that obstacle is a guess. It may be higher or lower. It's not measured, actually. It's just an estimate of how high that obstacle is. So when we're coming into runway 7, we need to note there is a possibly 92 feet obstacle here. So possible meaning it could be higher or lower. It could be 100 feet. It could be 80 feet. We don't know. But it is around 92 feet is what they're saying. And it also shows airport and touchdown zone elevation, which is, again, listed up here. Oops. It's also shown down here. Elevation 26, touchdown zone 26. So that's reading the chart, or the chart broken up into sections. Again, to really learn how to read these charts, we need to break the approach itself into sections. Alrighty, so we need to talk about approaches themselves. We've broken up the chart, now let's break up the approach. And remember, an approach is nothing more than straight lines flown between waypoints, and you could have to do a special maneuver at some points. And it's predetermined, or descents at predetermined points to predetermined altitudes. So, for the sake of our example, let's say we're flying into Brunswick Golden Isles. Let's add that to our plan. That's the airport we want to go to. Our last en route waypoint is the Brunswick VOR. How convenient. Alright, so we're in the en route environment. let's say we're on Tango 204, somewhere along here. Jack's approach is going to tell us the runway in use at Brunswick, as well as the altimeter and what approach we can expect. And let's say we're getting the VOR runway 4 approach. For some reason, the RNAV is not doable. Let's say we're in not in an RNAV equipped aircraft. So there, we're not in an RNAV equipped aircraft. That's going to be the route we would fly. Alrighty. So Brunswick's our last en route waypoint, and how convenient that is also the initial approach fix for the VOR runway 4. So let's break down an approach. We're on the en route, unbound to Brunswick. Then there's a transition. A transition is a way to take you from the en route environment to the initial approach fix. A transition can be a number of things. It can be radar vectors, it could be airways, it could be a direct route, it could be a star or a feeder route. It could be any number of things. And to determine what your transition will be, you just need to find a way of connecting your last en route waypoint to your initial approach fix. So if we were landing at Brunswick Golden Isles in this example, our last en route waypoint is the Brunswick VOR. Here's our transition. It'll be the feeder route, and we know it's a feeder route because it's a thin line, but it has an altitude, so it is flyable, and it takes us to the initial approach fix of Yoko, where we will do a hold in lieu of a procedure turn until we're ready to fly the approach. Let's look at a different example. Let's look at the RNAV runway 4 into McKinnon. Here we have HETOP. Our transitions could be HETOP, VIXRI, or FODEX. If we look at the en route chart, well, they're not depicted, are they? So how would we, if we were flying the, say for example, HETOP transition, how would we get to HETOP? Well, maybe there's a star that takes us. We would have to check that in pre-flight, or we could check it en route. If there's a star that takes us to HETOP, we can use that. Is there an airway that takes us to HETOP? We've already established we can't find it on the chart, so no. What about a direct route? Well, if we're flying, going back to, let's say we're flying around Tango 204, at some point we could veer off Tango 204 and head straight to HETOP. That could be a direct route. There are rules to flying direct routes. Most notably, you got to stay at above the MSA at least. You can't really fly the direct route until you are within 25 nautical miles of the MSA fix, which in the case of our RNAV here, the MSA fix that applies to us would be VIXRI, and we would be, once we're within 30 nautical miles of VIXRI, we can descend down to 2,700 until we're 12 nautical miles, then we can descend down to 2,000. So once we're within 30 nautical miles, we can fly direct HETOP and descend down to 2,700. And then once we're within 12 nautical miles of HETOP, we can descend down to 2,000. Or not 12 nautical miles of HETOP, 12 nautical miles of VIXRI, even though we're flying a HETOP. And then we'd fly HETOP, VIXRI, runway. That's essentially how that goes. So those are transitions. Then we have the initial leg. The initial leg takes you away from the airport. Remember, the approach is designed to take you down safely. So odds are you're going to be at a decently high altitude by the time you hit the transition. And a lot of times your initial approach fix pulls double duty as your final approach fix in a lot of cases. Case in point, the VOR approach that we're going to demo. The initial approach fix is either Widgeon or Brunswick, depending on which transition you're flying. But it's also the final approach fix. If you can see here, see how this little cross X here, that indicates that is your final approach fix. So Brunswick is our initial as well as our final. So we'll cross Brunswick at, say, 4,000. We could cross it at 4,000 feet. I don't know about you, but 4,000 feet and less than 4 miles to the runway, that sounds like a power dive to me if we wanted to land. So we need an initial leg to take us away from the airport far enough so that we can do a turnaround and descend. And that's what the initial leg does. So the initial leg, and just to note here, when you're on the initial leg, you are guaranteed 1 nautical mile separation from obstacles as well as 1,000 feet above them. So you want to be on course at all times, but it's not the end of the world if you're slightly off course on the initial leg, because you're guaranteed 1 nautical mile clearance as well as 1,000 feet. Now, we have a course reversal. So if we were flying the VOR approach, and let's say we were coming in from the north, so we go to Brunswick, then we fly outbound, course reversal. The course reversal could be a procedure turn or hold in lieu of a procedure turn, as we saw with the ILS approach here. No procedure turn, that is a hold in lieu. We would have to fly the holding pattern here, and then whenever we're ready, make the approach. Or we could, on this approach, Brunswick, HACCP, procedure turn, back in. What about no procedure turn transitions? Here we see 2000 NOPT on the SSI 7 DME arc. So if we were flying the widget transition, we'd fly this DME arc, and it says NOPT. What that means is when we complete the arc and we get to HACCP, we don't have to fly the procedure turn. That's basically what that means. So that's our initial leg right there, widget to HACCP. So the initial can be thought of as the leg that connects the initial approach fix to the intermediate approach fix, if there is one. In this approach, there is one. HACCP is your intermediate approach fix. Now, what is the intermediate approach fix? Well, the intermediate leg is nothing more than, the sole reason the intermediate leg exists is to connect the initial and the final together. And you can see it here. The initial approach is considered complete at the end of your course reversal. So whether we're flying the DME arc, which is considered a course reversal, or if we're flying the procedure turn, it's complete at our initial leg is done at the completion of that course reversal. So when we're done flying the arc, or when we're on course after the procedure turn, and that's when we're on the intermediate. We can descend down to the intermediate approach altitude, which is found at the final approach fix, ironically, 2,000 feet. There's a line below it, which means we need to be at or above 2,000 feet. And then the final, and oh, by the way, on the intermediate segment, you're given 500 feet above obstacles, but no lateral separation because it gets narrower on the intermediate. So if you see on this approach, the intermediate starts at HACCP and ends at Brunswick. So at HACCP, we're guaranteed 1 nautical mile separation from obstacles, but at Brunswick, we're not guaranteed any separation from obstacles laterally, just vertically. So yeah, on the intermediate, it gets narrower. So as you're on the intermediate, you really need to, this is when you want to make your corrections to find your wind correction angle and what attitude and all works to keep you on the course. This is where you want to be making those corrections, because you want to be on course on final. You don't want to deviate at all on final, really, because on final, you're not guaranteed any lateral separation at all from obstacles. You're only guaranteed vertical separation. And that vertical separation is 250 feet. So the way it works is initial leg, you're guaranteed 1 nautical mile and 1,000 feet separation from terrain and obstacles. Intermediate leg, you're guaranteed 500 feet separation from obstacles with a narrowing lateral separation. And final, you're guaranteed 250 feet separation from obstacles, no lateral separation. And the same applies to the missed approach. On the missed approach, you're only guaranteed obstacle separation. That's it. So if you follow the published missed approach path, you're guaranteed to not hit anything. You veer off that, you might. So, yeah. So and the final is obviously from the final approach fix to the runway threshold. That's the final. And at that point, when you call final, no one else should be taking off or landing. Alright, so that's the initial, and we also discussed intermediate and final there. What about the missed? Well, the missed is a way of taking you from the missed approach point. So let's say you get to the missed approach point, you couldn't find the runway. The missed approach is designed to take you safely away from the airport, back up, and either put you back in the en route environment or hold you at a position close to the initial approach fix so that you can decide what you're going to do. It's important to know ATC is probably going to ask you why you went missed, and please be honest with them. If you went missed because you were too fast or too high or whatever, tell them, because it's very important for them to know. If you went missed because you couldn't see the runway, that means the weather's gotten so bad they may have to close the airport because they're not going to be able to get planes in now. So yeah, you really need to be honest with approach when you go missed and they ask you why. So again, missed takes you safely away from the airport, only guarantees you obstacle separation. There's no dimensions for that. You're just guaranteed to not hit anything. They're not going to tell you how far away you're going to be from them. So yeah, missed will take you away from the airport, back up into the en route environment, and they always take you to a holding pattern. See, like on this one to Bourne, or on our approach, it takes you back to Brunswick, where you fly this hold at Brunswick. The reason it takes you to a holding pattern is to give you time to decide what you're going to do. Remember, you just went missed, you still got to get this plane on the ground, and you only have so much fuel. So when you go missed and you're in the holding pattern, or if you're flying something else, if ATC gave you an alternate missed approach, missed approach really only applies to lost comms, because if we go missed, this is an uncontrolled airport, so we're going to fly the first part of the missed approach anyway, but we contact approach again, tell them we are back with them at Brunswick missed approach, they're probably going to give us vectors to somewhere and ask us what we want to do next. Do we want to fly the holds published? Do we want to be sent somewhere to hold? Do we want to go to another airport, try a different approach, yada, yada, yada. So basically, when we're in the holding pattern, it's giving us time to decide, do we want to attempt the approach again? Maybe we were too high, too fast. Maybe you thought you saw the runway but couldn't confirm it, so you want to try again. Do you want to hold until the weather clears up and gets better, hopefully? Do you want to hold there and select and brief a different approach with lower minimums? Do you want to head to your alternate or a alternate? That's when you're in the hold patterns, when you're deciding that. Or if you're being vectored by ATC, if they didn't have you fly the published. Alright, so that is the approach broken up into sections. So again, en route, transition, initial, course reversal, intermediate, final, missed, possible final again. So that is the approach broken down. So enough with PowerPoint. Let's read some approach charts. So here we see the ILS localizer runway 7. And as we get ready to fly this approach, we would look at the briefing section, start setting up our radios, our course information. We would look at the plan view and cross-reference it with the en route to decide on our transition. So let's look at the approach we're actually going to demo fly. I don't know if I'm going to do a video of the demo flight because I've flown it god-awful amount of times on my channel before. So let's go with our route here from Tallahassee. So from Taylor, Victor 198 to Mana, and then Victor 441 to Brunswick, and from Brunswick we have to fly an approach. So our transition is going to be the Brunswick VOR, which with this one they would most likely give us radar vectors, because if you can see we're coming in from the south, it would make no sense for us to go to Widgeon, and it would make no sense for us to go to Brunswick, then radial 302 to Widgeon, then do the DME arc, then come back in. So they're most likely going to give you vectors in this case. And so even if you want to practice a full procedure approach, if they give you vectors, take it, because this is the only way you're going to get in if you're coming from the south, essentially. And this is the approach you're taking. In this case, they would probably actually elect to give you the RNAV if you could fly it, but let's say our aircraft's not capable of flying RNAV approaches for whatever reason, and yeah. So we'd have to fly the VOR approach, which means we get vectored onto final. So final approach fix is Brunswick. They would vector us and clear us for the approach. Basically, a vector just takes you onto the final approach course within 5 miles of the Brunswick VOR, or your final approach fix. They're not going to put you over here, or over here, or over here. Somewhere between here and here is where they're going to get you and clear you. So basically what that means is they're going to get you to the final approach fixed altitude of 2,000 feet at or above, and within 5 miles of the Brunswick VFR, then clear you for the approach. And from there, you just fly the approach as published from the final approach fix. And that's vectors to final. Full procedure, if we are coming to the south, we would have to fly to Brunswick, then 302 outbound, and we'd have to maintain the 2,700 minimum safe altitude for this. Then widget, DME arc, back to HSAP, down to 2,000, Brunswick, down to minimums, land, hopefully. Yeah, I know I'm moving a bit fast, so try to follow along with me, I guess is all I can say. So reading these, all this information up here, first, obviously we need to make sure we have the right approach and it serves the correct airport. We also need to make sure it's current by checking that. Then we would read this up here to see what the primary nav aid is and what the final approach fix is. You can find that out either by looking here or by looking on the plan view, because the final approach fix, in absence of a primary nav aid, the final approach fix is the center point. So if we look at the ILS, the primary nav aid for any ILS approach is, you guessed it, the localizer. So what's our final approach fix? Yoko. Where's Yoko? Right there. It's in sort of in the center of the plan view. They moved it over because they wanted to fit some other stuff in here, but it's kind of in the center of the plan view. And same here. On our navs, it's going to be in the center. Right here is the final approach fix of Yatki, right in the center of the plan view. However, on this VOR approach, our primary nav aid is the VOR, so it's going to be in the center. It just happens to be the final approach fix on this approach. So we'd set our radios up, set our course up, note the runway information, read the notes. If local altimeter setting not received, use Jacksonville International altimeter setting and decrease MDAs by 100 feet. So if for some reason the ASOS wasn't working or we couldn't receive it, we would tune Jacksonville International's ATIS, use their altimeter setting, and then increase our minimums by 100 feet. So instead of 500, it'd be 600. We'd read through the missed approach, set our comm radios up. We know we're going to be on ASOS, then the center is going to be giving us approach info, and then Unicom. Or CTAF, sorry. Yeah, even I get it mixed up sometimes. Okay, then we'd want to figure out what our transition's going to be. So we'd find where we're at on the en route chart, our last en route waypoint, in this case Brunswick. Where is that relative to chart? It's right there. So our transition is either going to be radar vectors or the widget transition starting from Brunswick. Because we're not going to be able to go to Brunswick, do a 180, and then turn around, fly to procedure turn to HSAB. We would absolutely have to go to Brunswick, 302 outbound, widget, then inbound. Now note the 302 radial is for navigation purposes because it doesn't have an altitude associated with it. The reason I'm saying we're flying it is because if we're coming from the south and we had to fly the full procedure, again, we can't go to Brunswick 180 procedure turn because that would be silly and unsafe. We would actually have to go to Brunswick, then the 302 radial to widget. And the reason we would do that is because of this right here. The minimum safe altitude is 2,700. So as long as we maintain 2,700 within 25 nautical miles of this VOR, we're not going to hit anything. And if you look on the en route environment, you can back this up because Victor 362 is the radial that they're talking about. 302 outbound from Brunswick is Victor 362, and if you look at the chart, 302 radial outbound. Here's widget. That's also a waypoint on the airway. So you could actually treat this as an airway transition, in which case you'd have to fly the minimum en route altitude of the airway. In fact, that's what I would do, because on the chart this is technically not flyable, but it is flyable on the en route. So you would maintain Victor 441 to Brunswick, then turn on to Victor 362 for 7 miles, and then till you hit widget, then you'd fly the DME arc. That just so happens to line up with this line right here. But, yeah, thin lines without altitudes you can't fly. It just so happens we can because this is also associated with an airway. Although we wouldn't know that solely by looking at this chart, and that is why these en route charts are invaluable. Alright, so that's how we'd fly that. That's how we'd pick our transition. Then we'd start reading the approach plate, doing our approach briefing. What's our minimum descent altitude? We would know our approach category. Aircraft are only in one category, by the way. So we would also want to check, as we're getting ready to fly this approach, if we can fly it. So once we got our weather from ASOS, we would want to check two things. One, what's the visibility? If the visibility is at or greater than this number right here, this -1, or this -1/4 or -1/2, depending on which category we're in, then we can fly the approach. But we'd also want to note this number here, the height above threshold number. Remember that on METAR's, TAF's, and ATIS and ASOS reports, the cloud heights are always given in height above ground at the airfield. Height above the airfield. AGL, basically. So, we do how we convert that. Instead of converting that to MSL, let's say the ceilings were overcast at 400, is what ASOS was telling us. Well, what do you know? When we're at minimums of 500 feet MSL, we're going to be 484 feet above the ground, which would put us in that cloud deck. That means, you guessed it, we may not be able to see the runway. Even though the visibility is above this, it's possible we may not be able to see the runway because we're still going to be in the cloud deck. So there you go. That's the two things you want to look at when you're getting your weather and seeing if you can fly the approach. Look at, first of all, are you equipped to fly this approach? Second of all, does the weather meet the minimums? And although the only weather minimum that is regulated to fly the approach is the visibility distance, it's a good idea to also look at the cloud decks. Because if they're overcast at 400 and you're going to be 484, almost 500 feet above the field, you're going to be in the soup. You're not going to see that runway. So, yeah. Then we would read minimum, see how low we can go. We'd look at the airport sketch to get an idea. And, again, they use symbology similar to the airport diagram. So we see runway 4. Now, we'd also want to note 027 degrees, 6.3 nautical miles from final approach fix. 027 degrees. So when we're coming in to land and we see the runway, this is the angle we're going to be coming at. We're not going to be coming straight at the runway, essentially. We're going to be coming off to the side a little bit. And, yeah, so we'd have to make corrections to line up with the runway. We also want to note there is a displaced threshold. See these fishtail markings? So there is a displaced threshold there. Note where the airport beacon is. Note any obstacles nearby. We have a 91 feet obstacle that's essentially on final right there. So we definitely want to take note of that. And even better, it's not assured that it's actually 91 feet. It's got that plus or minus symbol. It's around 91. Could be higher, could be lower. Isn't that lovely? So, yeah. We have a windsock there to help us out if we need it. Also note we have some closed taxiways. How lovely. So, yeah. This basically tells us the image we're going to look for when we're down at minimums. We want to be looking for that, as well as its lights. And it tells us the lights, too. Medium intensity on all runways. And that's basically it. Real quick, I want to point out this bit right here below the airport sketch. I actually consider this sort of part of the minimums section, even though it's listed underneath the airport sketch. And you can see why people combine these sections. Because if you see these bold lines separate out the sections, but I've combined them or separated them in different places just to make it easier to read them. I consider this part of the minimums because it tells you the distance from the final approach fix to the missed approach point, as well as how long it's going to take you to get there at certain ground speeds. So if we're flying the Cessna 172 on this approach, and we're at Brunswick, we would want to start our clock. Because if, let's say we didn't have DME, we could still fly this even though we don't have DME. Once we're at Brunswick, we start the clock and we know it's going to take us at 60 knots ground speed, 6 minutes, 18 seconds to reach the final approach fix. So if we hit 6 minutes, 20 seconds, we know we've gone past the final approach phase. If we hadn't seen the runway by now, we need to go around and fly the missed approach. And it listed in 60, 90, 120, 150, 180 knots. That's in ground speed. So you may have to do a little calculation for wind. Don't bother whipping out the E6B, just do some Kentucky windage. And you could interpolate to get exact measurements. Say if you're at 70 knots, I'm not going to interpolate. 70 knots, if it's 60 is 6 minutes, 90 is 4 minutes, 70 knots is going to get you around 5 minutes, 45 seconds. Close to it. So yeah, that's how you read approach charts, essentially. That's how you understand approach charts, I should say. Reading them is different because it's about translating this information to the aircraft. I know this video is getting kind of long, so just go read some, is what I'm saying. Again, there are helpful links in the description. I highly recommend you go to that Pilot Edge workshop link and watch the videos that Keith Smith made. Keith Smith, I hope I got his name right. He made a bunch of videos. They're about 2.5 hours to 3 hours long, each one of them. They're incredibly long, incredibly boring, incredibly dry, but really, really informative. He does a much better job of teaching this than I did. And note, this is also the longest video in the Reading Charts series. It's, God, looking at my clock, it's like an hour long now. I've been recording this video for an hour. I'm going to cut it down in editing. But yeah, there's a lot of information, and now you're seeing why I've never done this tutorial before, is because there's so much information here, there is no possible way to get all of it, or even if you break it down to just the important stuff, most of it is important, so there's no way to explain this stuff without having a really long, really boring video. So the main bit I want to translate or drive to you here is reading these is only half the battle. Knowing how to translate this into the airplane and fly it is the other half. And really, this comes with practice. The only way to really understand and get good with these is to study them and practice them. Look at different approach charts. See how they're different from other ones. Note this one has a 10 nautical mile circle around Brunswick. What does that mean? Well, that means everything is drawn to scale inside that 10 nautical mile circle. That also means, normally that means they want you to stay within that circle when doing a procedure turn. But as you can see, we have to go outside of that circle to find the airport. So what we could gather from this is that if we don't see the runway prior to Dammit or somewhere before Majax, we want to see the runway prior to Dammit. If we don't, the odds of us having to do the missed approach gets greater the closer we get to Majax. That's what we can take from that. And this is the VOR-B. So this is a circling only approach. Again, circling minimums. I want to talk about circling real quick before I close the video because I almost forgot. So I'm glad I looked at this. I almost forgot to talk about circling. Circling is a method that, let's say for whatever reason there were no other approaches at Brunswick Golden Isles. So no VORs, no RNAVs, no SIDs. This was the only approach. It's the VOR DME-B. Well, there's 2 runways at Brunswick Golden Isles. There may be more. Let's say for the sake of the argument that there's more runways. Let's say there's 4 runways at Brunswick Golden Isles. There's a let's imagine there's a perpendicular runway to the one that's actually there. Well, just because this approach is the ILS localizer runway 7, that doesn't mean we have to land on runway 7. Note, it has circling minimums as well. So we could fly this approach to runway 7 and then circle and land on runway 25. And basically that means, this is used most often at airports with multiple runways, but not all runways have instrument approaches. And the weather may be instrument and they need to use instrument approaches, but the wind could favor, or maybe the primary runway is closed, it could favor landing on the other runway. That's when circling minimums are used. So basically, with circling minimums, one approach can serve most, if not all, the runways at an airport. And with sidestep, which you would use circling minimums for sidestepping, that means that a single approach could serve 2 runways that are parallel and close to one another. Case in point, Atlanta. You could fly the ILS runway 26 right and land on 26 left. That's a sidestep. They may have separate sidestep minimums published, or they may just want you to use the circling minimums. And of course, with this approach, you got nothing but circling, because as you can see, it takes you pretty much perpendicular to the runway and drops you off 514 feet above the airfield. So yeah, this approach doesn't even take you down to the runway like the others we've looked at. Case in point, again, I want to stress, not all approaches take you down to the runway. That is a common misconception. They don't take you to the runway, they take you to a position where a normal landing can be made. That's what an approach does, which may not take you to the runway. It could drop you off above the airport at 500 feet, as you see here. So yeah, that was the reading charts tutorial. Again, the only way to really learn this stuff and get good at it is to read the charts, fly the approaches, practice, practice, practice. Practicing them is the only way to perfect them. There's no magical video that you can watch and then instantly be able to fly them. I'm giving you a lot of information to work with, and if you stuck around this long, hats off to you if you stuck around this long watching this video, because I don't know if I could have, and I recorded it. But yeah, so lots of information. I can't stress it enough that you need to read these, not just the ones I've shown here, which are the approaches for Brunswick, Golden Isles, and Brunswick-McKinnon in Brunswick, Georgia. You also need to look at other airports, say Atlanta, Jacksonville, St. Augustine, or go as far over as SoCal, LA, Santa Monica, Van Nuys, Dallas, New York, any of those. Just look at them. These are in a standard format, so they're the same, but each one's got differences. Practice reading them. And when you think you've gotten good enough reading them, go in your flight sim, be it XSX, X-Plane, P3D, if fucking Aerofly for all I care. Practice them. I mean, that's how it's done in real life. They just read them and practice them. That's the only way to get good at them. Practicing is the only way to perfect this. There's no magical video you can watch and magically be better at it. Practicing is the only way to do it. So I hope I've driven that point home. I've given you the information to work with to get you started, but reading these and practicing them yourself is the only way. Again, links in the description to the Pilot Edge workshops. Lots of information on those videos. Highly recommend you watch them as well. They're long. They're longer than this one. In fact, the videos covering instrument approaches are broken up into 4 parts, and they're 1.5 hours to 2 hours long each. So that's a full work day of watching videos if you binge watch them. But very informative videos. Great job by Keith Smith. He goes into much more detail than I did. And if you watch them and you find a discrepancy between what I've said and what he said, go with Keith because he's smarter than I am. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this video. Hats off to you if you stuck around this long. See you next time.